The loss of the sense of tragedy. A final consequence and evidence of the loss of our conviction of the worth and dignity of the person is that we have lost the sense of the tragic significance of human life. For the sense of tragedy is simply the other side of one's belief in the importance of the human individual. Tragedy implies a profound respect for the human being and a devotion to his rights and destiny. Otherwise, it just doesn't matter whether Orestes or Lear or you or I fall or stand in our struggles. Arthur Miller, in the preface to his play The Death of a Salesman, makes some telling comments on the lack of tragedy in our day. The tragic character, he writes, is one who is ready to lay down his life, if need be, to secure one thing, his sense of personal dignity. And, quote, "The tragic right is a condition of life, a condition in which the human personality is able to flower and realize itself." End quote. These conditions obtained in the periods in Western history when great tragedy was written. One has only to look at 5th century Greece, when Aeschylus and Sophocles wrote the mighty tragedies of Oedipus, Agamemnon, and Orestes, or at Elizabethan England when Shakespeare gave us Lear and Hamlet and Macbeth. But in our age of emptiness, tragedies are relatively rare, or if they are written, the tragic aspect is the very fact that human life is so empty, as in Eugene O'Neill's drama, The Iceman Cometh. This play is set in a saloon, and its dramatis personae, alcoholics, prostitutes, and, as the chief character, a man who in the course of the play goes psychotic, can dimly recall the periods in their lives when they did believe in something. It is this echo of human dignity in a great void of emptiness that gives this drama the power to elicit the emotions of pity and terror of classical tragedy. Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, which we have mentioned earlier, is itself one of the few real tragedies about the common people, neither alcoholics nor psychotics, who make up the social situation in this country out of which most of us have sprung. In the movie version of this drama, Willy Loman, the salesman, is unfortunately made to look pathetic. Those who saw only the movie may have to imagine Willy in a broader context to appreciate his real tragic import. He was a man who took seriously the teachings of his society, that success should attend hard, energetic work, that economic progress is a reality, and that if one has the right contacts, achievement and salvation should follow. It is easy enough, from our later perspective, to see through Willy's illusions and to poke fun at his unsound go-getter values. But that is not the point. The one thing that matters is that Willy believed. He took seriously his own existence and what he had been taught he could rightly expect from life. "I don't say he is a great man," says his wife in describing Willy's disintegration to their sons, "but he's a human being, and a terrible thing is happening to him, so attention must be paid." The tragic fact is not that Willy is a man of the grandeur of Lear or the inward richness of Hamlet. He's only a little boat looking for a harbor, as his wife always says. But it is the tragedy of a historical period. If one multiplies Willy by the hundreds of thousands of fathers and brothers who also believed what they were taught but found in the changing times that it did not work, one has enough to shake one with pity and fear, as in the tragedies of old. He never knew who he was, and he was one who took seriously his right to know. The flaw or crack in the tragic character, Miller writes, is really nothing, and need be nothing, but his inherent unwillingness to remain passive in the face of what he conceives to be a challenge to his dignity, his image of his rightful status. Only the passive, only those who accept their lot without active retaliation are flawless. Most of us are in that category. Miller goes on to point out that the quality in a tragedy which shakes us, quote, derives from the underlying fear of being displaced, the disaster inherent in being torn away from our chosen image of what and who we are in this world. Among us today, this fear is as strong and perhaps stronger than it ever was." End quote. Let no one assume we are advocating a pessimistic view when we mourn the loss of the tragic sense. On the contrary, as Miller also notes, quote, "Tragedy implies more optimism in its author than does comedy, and its final result ought to be the reinforcement of the onlooker's brightest opinions of the human animal." End quote. For the tragic view indicates that we take seriously man's freedom and his need to realize himself. It demonstrates our belief in the, quote, "indestructible will of man to achieve his humanity." End quote. The knowledge of human nature and the insights into man's unconscious conflicts, which are disclosed in psychotherapy, give new ground for believing in the tragic aspects of human life. The psychotherapist, privileged to be an intimate witness to some person's inner wrestling and their often grave and bitter struggles with themselves and with external forces which challenge their dignity, gains a new respect for these persons and a new realization of the potential dignity of the human being. Countless times a week, furthermore, he receives proof in his consulting work that when men at last accept the fact that they cannot successfully lie to themselves, and at last learn to take themselves seriously, they discover previously unknown and often remarkable recuperative powers within themselves. The picture of the roots of the malady of our time given in this chapter adds up to a bleak diagnosis, but it does not necessarily imply a bleak prognosis. For the positive side is that we have no choice but to move ahead. We are like people partway through psychoanalysis whose defenses and delusions are broken through, and their only choice is to push on to something better. We, and by we I mean everyone, however old or young, who is aware of the historical situation in which we live, are not the lost generation of the 1920s. The term lost, when applied to members of that period of adolescent rebellion following the First World War, meant that one was temporarily away from home, and could go back again whenever one became too frightened at being on one's own. But we are, rather, the generation which cannot turn back. We in the middle of the 20th century are like pilots in the transatlantic flight, who have passed the point of no return, who do not have fuel enough to go back, but must push on regardless of storms or other dangers. What, then, is the task before us? The implications are clear in the above analysis. We must rediscover the sources of strength and integrity within ourselves. This, of course, goes hand in hand with the discovery and affirmation of values in ourselves and in our society which will serve as the core of unity. But no values are effective in a person or a society except as there exists in the person the prior capacity to do the valuing, that is, the capacity actively to choose and affirm the values by which he lives. This the individual must do, and in this way he will help lay the groundwork for the new constructive society which will eventually come out of this disturbed time, as the Renaissance came out of the disintegration of the Middle Ages. William James once remarked that those who are concerned with making the world more healthy had best start with themselves. We could go farther and point out that finding the center of strength within ourselves is in the long run the best contribution we can make to our fellow men. It is said that when the fisherman in the sea around Norway sees his boat heading for a maelstrom, he reaches ahead to try to throw an oar into the boiling whirlpool. If he can do so, the maelstrom quiets down, and he and his boat go safely through. Just so, one person with indigenous inner strength exercises a great calming effect on panic among people around him. This is what our society needs, not new ideas and inventions, important as these are, and not geniuses and supermen, but persons who can be, that is, persons who have a center of strength within themselves. It is our task in these chapters to try to find the sources of this inner strength. Part 2. Rediscovering Selfhood. 3. The experience of becoming a person. To undertake this venture of becoming aware of ourselves and to discover the sources of inner strength and security which are the rewards of such a venture, let us start at the beginning by asking, what is this person, this sense of selfhood we seek? A few years ago, a psychologist procured a baby chimpanzee the same age as his infant son. In order to do an experiment such as is the wont of these men, he raised the baby chimp and baby human being in his household together. For the first few months, they developed at very much the same speed, playing together and showing very little difference. But after a dozen months or so, a change began to occur in the development of the little human baby, and from then on there was a great difference between him and the chimp. This is what we would expect, for there is very little difference between the human being and any mammal baby from the time of the original unity of the fetus in the womb of its mother, through the beginning of the beating of its own heart, then its ejection as an infant from the womb at birth, the commencing of its own breathing, and the first protected months of life. But around the age of 2, more or less, there appears in the human being the most radical and important emergence so far in evolution, namely his consciousness of himself. He begins to be aware of himself as an I. As the fetus in the womb, the infant has been part of the original we with its mother, and it continues as part of the psychological we in early infancy. But now the little child, for the first time, becomes aware of his freedom. He senses his freedom, as Gregory Bateson puts it, within the context of the relationship with his father and mother. He experiences himself as an identity who is separated from his parents and can stand against them if need be. This remarkable emergence is the birth of the human animal into a person. Consciousness of self, the unique mark of man. This consciousness of self, this capacity to see oneself as though from the outside, is the distinctive characteristic of man. A friend of mine has a dog who waits at his studio door all morning, and when anybody comes to the door, he jumps up and barks, wanting to play. My friend holds that the dog is saying in his barking, "Here is a dog who has been waiting all morning for someone to come to play with him. Are you the one?" This is a nice sentiment, and all of us who like dogs enjoy protecting such cozy thoughts into their heads. But actually, this is exactly what the dog cannot say. He can show that he wants to play and entice you into throwing his ball for him, but he cannot stand outside himself and see himself as a dog doing these things. He is not blessed with the consciousness of self. Inasmuch as this means the dog is also free from neurotic anxiety and guilt feelings, which are the doubtful blessings of the human being, some people would prefer to say the dog is not cursed with the consciousness of self. Walt Whitman, echoing his thought, envies the animals. "I think I could turn and live with animals. They do not sweat and whine about their condition. They do not lie awake in the dark and weep for their sins." But actually, man's consciousness of himself is the source of his highest qualities. It underlies his ability to distinguish between I and the world. It gives him the capacity to keep time, which is simply the ability to stand outside the present and to imagine oneself back in yesterday or ahead in the day after tomorrow. Thus, human beings can learn from the past and plan for the future. And thus, man is the historical mammal in that he can stand outside and look at his history, and thereby he can influence his own development as a person. And to a minor extent, he can influence the march of history in his nation and society as a whole. The capacity for consciousness of self also underlies man's ability to use symbols, which is a way of disengaging something from what it is, such as the two sounds which make up the word table, and agreeing that these sounds will stand for a whole class of things. Thus man can think in abstractions like beauty, reason, and goodness. This capacity for consciousness of ourselves gives us the ability to see ourselves as others see us and to have empathy with others. It underlies our remarkable capacity to transport ourselves into someone else's parlor where we will be in reality next week, and then in imagination to think and plan how we will act. And it enables us to imagine ourselves in someone else's place and to ask how we would feel and what we would do if we were this other person. No matter how poorly we use or fail to use or even abuse these capacities, they are the rudiments of our ability to begin to love our neighbor, to have ethical sensitivity, to see truth, to create beauty, to devote ourselves to ideals, and to die for them if need be. To fulfill these potentialities is to be a person. That is what is meant when it is stated in the Hebrew Christian religious tradition that man is created in the image of God. But these gifts come only at a high price, the price of anxiety and inward crises. The birth of the self is no simple and easy matter, for the child now faces the frightful prospect of being out on his own, alone, and without the full protection of the decisions of his parents. It is no wonder that when he begins to feel himself an identity in his own right, he may feel terribly powerless in comparison with the great and strong adults around him. In the midst of a struggle over her dependency on her mother, one person had this eloquent dream. Quote, "I was in a little boat tied to a big boat. We were going through the ocean and big waves came up, piling over the sides of my boat. I wondered whether it was still tied to the big boat." End quote. The healthy child, who is loved and supported but not coddled by his parents, will proceed in his development despite this anxiety and the crises that face him. And there may be no particular external signs of trauma or special rebelliousness. But when his parents consciously or unconsciously exploit him for their own ends or pleasure, or hate or reject him, so that he cannot be sure of minimal support when he tries out his new independence, the child will cling to the parents and will use his capacity for independence only in the forms of negativity and stubbornness. If, when the first begins tentatively to say no, his parents beat him down rather than love and encourage him, he thereafter will say no, not as a form of true independent strength, but as a mere rebellion. Or if, as in the majority of cases in the present day, the parents themselves are anxious and bewildered in the tumultuous seas of the changing times, unsure of themselves and beset by self-doubts, their anxiety will carry over and lead the child to feel that he lives in a world in which it is dangerous to venture into becoming oneself. This brief sketch is schematic, to be sure, and it is meant to give us as adults a kind of retrospective picture in the light of which we can better understand how one fails to achieve selfhood. Most of the data for these conflicts of childhood come from adults who are struggling, in dreams, memories, or in present-day relations, to overcome what in their past lives originally blocked them in becoming fully born as persons. Almost every adult is, in greater or lesser degree, still struggling on the long journey to achieve selfhood on the basis of the patterns which were set in his early experiences in the family. Nor do we for a moment overlook the fact that selfhood is always born in a social context. Genetically, Odin is quite right. For the ego is a dream, till a neighbor's need by name create it. Or, as we put it above, the self is always born and grows in interpersonal relationships, but no ego moves on into responsible selfhood if it remains chiefly the reflection of the social context around it. In our particular world in which conformity is the great destroyer of selfhood, in our society in which fitting the pattern tends to be accepted as the norm, and being well-liked is the alleged ticket to salvation, what needs to be emphasized is not only the admitted fact that we are to some extent created by each other, but also our capacity to experience and create ourselves. On the very day I was writing these words, a young intern reported in his psychoanalytic session a dream which is essentially parallel to the dreams of almost everyone who is in a crisis in his growth. This young man had originally come for psychoanalytic help as a medical student because of attacks of anxiety so severe and prolonged that he was on the verge of dropping out of medical school. His problems were chiefly due to his close tie to his mother, a very unstable but strong and dominating woman. Having by now completed his medical studies, he was a successful intern and had applied for the most responsible residency in the hospital for the next year. The day preceding the night on which he had this dream, he had received a letter from the hospital directors awarding him the residency and paying him compliments on his excellent work as an intern. But instead of being pleased, he had been suddenly seized with an attack of anxiety. The dream follows in his own words. I was bicycling to my childhood home where my father and mother were. The place seemed beautiful. When I went in, I felt free and powerful, as I am in my real life as a doctor now, not as I was as a boy. But my mother and father would not recognize me. I was afraid to express my independence for fear I would be kicked out. I felt as lonely and separate as though I were at the North Pole and there were no people around, but only snow and ice for thousands of miles. I walked through the house, and in the different rooms were signs tacked up, "Wipe your feet," and "Clean your hands." The anxiety after this being offered the desired position indicates that something in it, or in the responsibility it entailed, very much frightened him. And the dream tells us why. If he is a responsible, independent person in his own right, in contrast to the boy tied to his mother's apron strings, he will be ejected from his family and will be isolated and alone. The fascinating vignettes in the form of the "Wipe your feet" signs add a footnote which says the house is like a military camp and not a loving home at all. The real question facing this young man, of course, was why he dreamed of going home at all. What need was there within himself to go back to mother and father in the house he pictured as externally beautiful in the dream, when he is confronted with responsibility? This is a question we shall deal with later. Here let us only emphasize how becoming a person, an identity in one's own right, is the original development which begins in infancy and carries over into adulthood, no matter how old one may be. And the crises it involves may cause tremendous anxiety. No wonder many persons repress the conflict and try all their lives to run from the anxiety. What does it mean to experience one's self as a self? The experience of our own identity is the basic conviction that we all start with as psychological beings. It can never be proven in a logical sense, for consciousness of one's self is the presupposition of any discussion about it. There will always be an element of mystery in one's awareness of one's own being. Mystery here meaning a problem the data of which encroach on the problem. For such awareness is a presupposition of inquiry into one's self, that is to say, even to meditate on one's own identity as a self means that one is already engaging in self-consciousness. Some psychologists and philosophers are distrustful of the concept of self. They argue against it because they do not like separating man from the continuum with animals, and they believe the concept of the self gets in the way of scientific experimentation. But rejecting the concept of self as unscientific, because it cannot be reduced to mathematical equations, is roughly the same as the argument 2 and 3 decades ago that Freud's theories and the concept of unconscious motivation were unscientific. It is a defensive and dogmatic science, and therefore not true science, which uses a particular scientific method as a Procrustean bed and rejects all forms of human experience which don't fit. To be sure, the continuum between man and animals should be seen clearly and realistically, but one need not jump to the unwarranted conclusion that therefore there is no distinction between man and animals. We do not need to prove the self as an object. It is only necessary that we show how people have the capacity for self-relatedness. The self is the organizing function within the individual and the function by means of which one human being can relate to another. It is prior to, not an object of, our science. It is presupposed in the fact that one can be a scientist. Human experience always goes beyond our particular methods of understanding it at any given moment. And the best way to understand one's identity as a self is to look into one's own experience. Let us, for example, imagine the inner experience of some psychologist or philosopher writing a paper to deny the concept of consciousness of self. During the weeks he was considering writing this paper, he no doubt many times pictured himself sitting at his desk at some future day writing away. And from time to time, let us say, both before he actually began to write and later as he sat at his desk at work on the paper, he considered in fantasy what his colleagues would say about the paper, whether Professor so-and-so would praise it, whether other colleagues would say, "How brilliant this is," whether still others might think it stupid, and so on. In every thought he is seeing himself as an identity as definitely as he would see a colleague walking across the street. His every thought, in the process of arguing against the consciousness of self, proves this very consciousness in himself. The consciousness of one's identity as a self certainly is not an intellectual idea. The French philosopher Descartes, at the beginning of the modern period 3 centuries ago, crawled into his stove, according to legend, to meditate in solitude all one day, trying to find the basic principle for human existence. He came out of his stove in the evening with the famous conclusion, "I think, therefore I am." That is to say, I exist as a self because I am a thinking creature. But this is not enough. You and I never think of ourselves as an idea. We rather picture ourselves as doing something, like the psychologist writing his paper, and we then experience in imagination the feelings that we will have when we are in actuality doing that thing. That is to say, we experience ourselves as a thinking, intuiting, feeling, and acting unity. The self is thus not merely the sum of the various roles one plays, it is the capacity by which one knows he plays these roles. It is the center from which one sees and is aware of these so-called different sides of himself. After these perhaps high-sounding phrases, let us remind ourselves that after all, the experience of one's own identity, or becoming a person, is the simplest experience in life, even though at the same time the most profound. As everyone knows, a little child will react indignantly and strongly if you, in teasing, call him by the wrong name. It is as though you take away his identity, a most precious thing to him. In the Old Testament, the phrase, "I will blot out their names," to erase their identity, and it will be as though they never had existed, is a more powerful threat even than physical death. 2 little girl twins gave a vivid illustration of how important it is for a child to be a person in her own right. The little girls were good friends, a fact made especially possible because they complemented each other, one being extrovert and always in the center of the crowd if people came to visit in the house, the other being perfectly happy by herself to draw with her crayons and make up little poems. The parents, as parents generally do with twins, had dressed them alike when they went out walking. When they were about 3 1/2, the little extrovert girl began to want always to wear a different kind of dress from her sister. If she dressed after her sister, she would even, if necessary, wear an older and less pretty dress so that it would not be the same as the twin was wearing. Or if the sister dressed after her before they went out, she would beg her, sometimes weeping, not to put on the same matching dress. For days this puzzled the parents, since the child was not anxious in other ways. Finally, the parents, on a hunch, asked the little girl, "When you two go out walking, do you like to have the people on the street say, 'Look at these nice twins'?" Immediately, the little girl exclaimed, "No, I want them to say, 'Look at these 2 different people.'" This spontaneous exclamation, obviously revealing something very important to the little girl, cannot be explained by saying that the child wanted attention, for she would have gotten more attention if she had dressed as a twin. It shows, rather, her demand to be a person in her own right, to have personal identity, a need which was more important to her even than attention or prestige. The little girl rightly stated the goal for every human being, to become a person. Every organism has one and only one central need in life, to fulfill its own potentialities. The acorn becomes an oak, the puppy becomes a dog and makes the fond and loyal relations with its human masters which befit the dog. And this is all that is required of the oak tree and the dog. But the human being's task in fulfilling his nature is much more difficult, for he must do it in self-consciousness. That is, his development is never automatic, but must be to some extent chosen and affirmed by himself. Quote, "Among the works of man," John Stuart Hill has written, "which human life is rightly employed in perfecting and in beautifying, the first importance surely is man himself. Human nature is not a machine to be built after a model and set to do exactly the work prescribed for it, but a tree, which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides, according to the tendency of the inward forces which make it a living thing." End quote. In this charmingly expressed thought, John Stuart Mill has unfortunately omitted the most important tendency of the inward forces, which make a man a living thing, namely, that man does not grow automatically like a tree, but fulfills his potentialities only as he in his own consciousness plans and chooses. Fortunately, the long protracted period of infancy and childhood in human life, in contrast to the condition of the acorn, which is on its own as soon as it falls to the soil, or of the puppy which must fend for itself after a few weeks, prepares the child for this difficult task. He is able to acquire some knowledge and inner strength, so that as he must begin to choose and decide, he has some capability for it. Man, furthermore, must make his choices as an individual, for individuality is one side of one's consciousness of oneself. We can see this point clearly when we realize that consciousness of oneself is always a unique act. I can never know exactly how you see yourself, and you never know exactly how I relate to myself. This is the inner sanctum, where each man must stand alone. This fact makes for much of the tragedy and inescapable isolation in human life, but it also indicates again that we must find the strength in ourselves to stand in our own inner sanctum as individuals. And this fact means that, since we are not automatically merged with our fellows, we must through our own affirmation learn to love each other. If any organism fails to fulfill its potentialities, it becomes sick, just as your legs would wither if you never walked. But the power of your legs is not all you would lose. The flowing of your blood, your heart action, your whole organism would be weaker. And in the same way, if man does not fulfill his potentialities as a person, he becomes to that extent constricted and ill. This is the essence of neurosis, the person's unused potentialities blocked by hostile conditions in the environment, past or present, and by his own internalized conflicts, turn inward and cause morbidity. Quote, "Energy is eternal delight," said William Blake. "He who desires but acts not breeds pestilence." Kafka was a master at the gruesome task of picturing people who do not use their potentialities and therefore lose their sense of being persons. The chief character in the trial and in the castle has no name. He is identified only by an initial, a mute symbol of one's lack of identity in one's own right. In this staggering and frightful parable, Metamorphosis, Kafka illustrates what happens when the human being forfeits his powers. The hero of this story is a typical empty modern young man who lives a routine, vacuous life as a salesman, returning regularly to his middle-class home, eating the same menu of roast beef every Sunday while his father goes to sleep at the table. The young man's life was so empty implies Kafka, that he woke up one morning no longer a human being but a cockroach. Because he had not fulfilled his status as a man, he forfeited his human potentialities. A cockroach, like lice and rats and vermin, lives off others' leavings. It is a parasite, and in most people's minds, a symbol for what is unclean and repugnant. Could there be any more powerful symbol of what happens when a human being relinquishes his nature as a person? But to the extent that we do fulfill our potentialities as persons, we experience the profoundest joy to which the human being is heir. When a little child is learning to walk up steps or lift a box, he will try again and again, getting up when he falls down and starting over again. And finally, when he does succeed, he laughs with gratification, his expression of joy in the use of his powers. But this is nothing in comparison to the quiet joy when the adolescent can use his newly emerged power for the first time to gain a friend, or the adult's joy when he can love, plan, and create. Joy is the affect which comes when we use our powers. Joy, rather than happiness, is the goal of life, for joy is the emotion which accompanies our fulfilling our natures as human beings. It is based on the experience of one's identity as a being of worth and dignity, who is able to affirm his being, if need be, against all other beings and the whole inorganic world. This power in its ideal form is shown in the life of a Socrates, who was so confident in himself and his values that he could take his being condemned to death, not as a defeat, but as a greater fulfillment than compromising his beliefs. But we do not wish to imply such joy is only for the heroic and the outstanding. It is as present qualitatively in anyone's act, no matter how inconspicuous, which is done as an honest and responsible expression of his own powers. Are you enjoying this reading so far? Welcome to Right Here Audio, the group run by students for students who wish they had someone to read academic literature to them. We read content for anyone who has a hard time reading by themselves. This includes persons with blindness, dyslexia, ADHD, and anyone else who could use some support. Do you have anything you would like us to read for you? Comment down below and we'll get started. For those of you who have supported us since day one, we are so grateful for your support. And if you're new or haven't subscribed yet, join our small community dedicated to increasing accessibility one small step at a time. Now, let's get back to our reading. Self-contempt, a substitute for self-worth. But here we must pause to answer two objections. Some readers may be thinking that this emphasis on the necessity and value of consciousness of self will make people too concerned about themselves. One objection would be that it leads to be too introspective, and another that it makes for pride in oneself. Persons with this latter objection might raise the questions, are we not told not to think too highly of ourselves? And has it not been proclaimed that man's pride in himself is the root of most evil in our time? Let us consider the latter objection first. To be sure, one ought not to think too highly of oneself, and a courageous humility is the mark of the realistic and mature person. But thinking too highly of oneself, in the sense of self-inflation and conceit, does not come from greater consciousness of oneself or greater feelings of self-worth. In fact, it comes from just the opposite. Self-inflation and conceit are generally the external signs of inner emptiness and self-doubt. A show of pride is one of the most common covers for anxiety. Pride was a chief characteristic of the famous Roaring 1920s, but we know now that this period was one of widespread suppressed anxiety. The person who feels weak becomes a bully, the inferior person the braggart. A flexing of muscles, much talk, cockiness, and endeavor to brazen it out are the symptoms of covert anxiety in a person or a group. Tremendous pride was exhibited in fascism, as everyone knows who has seen the pictures of the strutting Mussolini and psychopathic Hitler. But fascism is a development in people who are empty, anxious, and despairing, and therefore seize on megalomaniac promises. To push this question deeper, many of the arguments in our day against pride in oneself, and many of the homilies on alleged self-abnegation, have a motive quite other than humility or a courageous facing of one's human situation. A great number of these arguments, for example, reveal a considerable contempt for the self. Aldous Huxley writes, "For all of us, the most intolerably dreary and deadening life is that which we live with ourselves." Fortunately, it can be remarked immediately. This generalization is obviously untrue. It is empirically not a fact that the most dreary and deadening hours of Spinoza were those he lived with himself, or of Thoreau, or of Einstein, or of Jesus, or of many a human being who has no fame whatever, but who has ventured, as Kierkegaard puts it, to become conscious of himself. In fact, I seriously doubt whether Huxley's remark is true even of himself, or of Reinhold Niebuhr, or others who with so much self-confidence and assertiveness proclaim the evils of man's asserting himself. Indeed, it is very easy to get an audience these days if one preaches against conceit and pride in oneself, for most people feel so empty and convinced of their lack of worth anyway that they readily agree that the one who is condemning them must be right. This leads us to the most important point of all in understanding the dynamics of much modern self-condemnation, namely that condemning ourselves is the quickest way to get a substitute sense of worth. People who have almost, but not quite, lost their feeling of worth generally have very strong needs to condemn themselves, for that is the most ready way of drowning the bitter ache of feelings of worthlessness and humiliation. It is as though the person were saying to himself, "I must be important that I am so worth condemning," or "Look how noble I am, I have such high ideals, and I am so ashamed of myself that I fall short." A psychoanalyst once pointedly remarked that when someone in psychoanalysis berates himself at great length for picayune sins, he feels like asking, "Who do you think you are?" The self-condemning person is very often trying to show how important he is that God is so concerned with punishing him. Much self-condemnation, thus, is a cloak for arrogance. Those who think they overcome pride by condemning themselves could well ponder Spinoza's remark, quote, "One who despises himself is the nearest to a proud man," end quote. In ancient Athens, when a politician was trying to get the votes of the working class by appearing very humble in a tattered coat with big holes in it, Socrates unmasked his hypocrisy by exclaiming, "Your vanity shows forth from every hole in your coat." The mechanism of much of this self-condemnation in our day can be observed in psychological depressions. The child, for example, who feels he is not loved by his parents can always say, generally to himself, "If I were different, if I were not bad, they would love me." By this means, he avoids facing the full force and the terror of the realization that he is not loved. Thus, too, with adults, if they can condemn themselves, they do not need really to feel the pain of their isolation or emptiness, and the fact that they are not loved then does not cast doubt upon their feeling of worth as persons, for they can always say, "If it were not for such and such a sin or bad habit, I would be loved." In our age of hollow people, the emphasis upon self-condemnation is like whipping a sick horse. It achieves a temporary lift, but it hastens the eventual collapse of the dignity of the person. The self-condemning substitute for self-worth provides the individual with a method of avoiding an open and honest confronting of his problems of isolation and worthlessness, and makes for a pseudo-humility rather than the honest humility of one who seeks to face his situation realistically and do what he can constructively. Furthermore, the self-condemning substitute provides the individual with a rationalization for his self-hate, and thus reinforces the tendencies toward hating himself. And, inasmuch as one's attitudes toward other selves generally parallel one's attitude toward oneself, one's covert tendency to hate others is also rationalized and reinforced. The steps are not big from the feeling of worthlessness of one's self to self-hatred to hatred for others. In the circles where self-contempt is preached, It is, of course, never explained why a person should be so ill-mannered and inconsiderate as to force his company on other people if he finds it so dreary and deadening himself. And furthermore, the multitude of contradictions are never adequately explained in a doctrine which advises that we should hate the one self, I, and love all others, with the obvious expectation that they will love us, hateful creatures that we are, or that the more we hate ourselves, the more we love God, who made the mistake, in an off moment, of creating this contemptible creature, I. Fortunately, however, we no longer have to argue that self-love is not only necessary and good, but that it is also a prerequisite for loving others. Erich Fromm, in his persuasive analysis, Selfishness and Self-Love, has made it clear that selfishness and excessive self-concern really come from an inner self-hatred. He points out that self-love is not only not the same as selfishness, but is actually the opposite to it. That is to say, the person who inwardly feels worthless is the one who must build himself up by selfish aggrandizement, and the person who has had a sound experience of his own worth, that is, who loves himself, has the basis for acting generously toward his neighbor. Fortunately, it also becomes clear from a longer religious perspective that much contemporaneous self-condemning and self-contempt are a product of particular modern problems. Calvin's contemptuous view of the self was closely related to the fact that individuals felt so insignificant in the industrial developments of the modern period. And the 20th century self-contempt arises not only from Calvinism, but also from our disease of emptiness. Thus, the modern self-contemptuous emphasis is not representative of the long-term Hebrew Christian tradition. Kierkegaard has expressed this most forcibly. If anyone, therefore, will not learn from Christianity to love himself in the right way, then neither can he love his neighbor. To love oneself in the right way and to love one's neighbor are absolutely analogous concepts, are at the bottom one and the same. Hence the law is, you shall love yourself as you love your neighbor when you love him as yourself. Consciousness of self is not introversion. The other objection we mentioned above may arise in the reader's mind in questions like these. Quote, ought we not to try to forget ourselves? Does not consciousness of oneself make one self-conscious in the sense of being shy, embarrassed, and socially inhibited? End quote. Some questioners would no doubt mention the famous centipede, who came to grief because of too much thinking which leg came after which, and so lay distracted in the ditch. The moral of the centipede, obviously, is, see what happens to you if you get too conscious of what you are doing. Before answering these objections, we must point out how unfortunate it is that self-consciousness is identified in this country with morbid introspection, shyness, and embarrassment. Naturally, the last thing in the world anyone would want, then, to be is self-conscious. But our language plays tricks on us. The German language is more accurate in this regard. The word for self-consciousness also means self-confident, which is as it should be. An example will make clear that what we are talking about is just the opposite to shyness, embarrassment, and morbid introversion. A young man came for psychotherapy because, though he was intellectually very competent and seemed superficially to be very successful, his spontaneity was almost completely blocked. He could not love anyone, and he got no real enjoyment from human companionship. These problems were accompanied by a good deal of anxiety and recurrent depressions. It had always been his habit to stand outside himself, look at himself, never letting himself go, until this self-concern became exceedingly painful. In listening to music, he was so concerned with how well he was listening that he would not hear the music. Even in making love, it was as though he were standing outside, watching himself and asking, "How am I doing?" As could be imagined, this put quite a crimp in his style. He was afraid, when he entered psychotherapy and discovered that he would have to become more aware of what was going on within himself, that he would become more self-conscious and therefore his problems would become worse. He was the only child of anxious parents who had very much overprotected him, never going out at night, for example, because of their hesitancy to leave him alone. Though the parents were ostensibly liberal and rational in all dealings with the son, he could never remember in all his childhood that he ever once talked back to them. The parents would brag about his achievements in school to relatives, cutting clippings about his successes from the papers, and taking pride in the fact that he was brighter than his cousins, but they rarely expressed real appreciation directly to him. Thus already as a child he was unable to develop a feeling of his own independent power and worth, and used as a substitute an over-concern for the praise which came, at least indirectly, from winning prizes in school. Add to this that he spent his early teens in Hitler Germany, where he was exposed continuously to propaganda about his supposed worthlessness as a Jew. Thus his standing off and continually looking at himself as an adult was like continuing to cut clippings from the newspaper, judging and measuring himself, trying to prove to himself that the Nazis were not right, and trying to get genuine affirmation of himself as a person from his parents. This case is very much oversimplified, to be sure. We wish only to illustrate that this person's morbid self-consciousness and his inability to be spontaneous and wholehearted were connected precisely with the lack of consciousness of himself, precisely the lack of the experience that he was the acting I. To be merely an observer of oneself, to treat oneself as an object, is to be a stranger to oneself. The famous centipede is generally a rationalization used by those who do not wish to go through the difficult process of enlarging consciousness of themselves. Furthermore, it is not an accurate fable. The less aware you are of how to drive a car, for example, or of the traffic conditions you are driving through, the more tense you are, and the firmer hold you have to keep on yourself. But on the other hand, the more experienced you are as a driver and the more conscious you are of the traffic problems and what to do in emergencies, the more you can relax at the wheel with a sense of power. You have the awareness that it is you who are doing the driving, you in control. Consciousness of self actually expands our control of our lives, and with that expanded power comes the capacity to let ourselves go. This is the truth behind the seeming paradox, that the more consciousness of oneself one has, the more spontaneous and creative one can be at the same time. To be sure, the advice to forget the childish self, the infantile self, is good advice, but it rarely does any good. It is true, furthermore, that one does in one sense forget oneself in creative activity, as we shall see in the next chapter. But first we must consider the difficult question of how one achieves consciousness of himself. The experiencing of one's body and feelings. In the achieving of consciousness of oneself, most people must start back at the beginning and rediscover their feelings. It is surprising how many people only have a general acquaintance with what they feel. They tell you they feel fine or lousy, as vaguely as though they were saying, China is in the Orient. Their connection with their feelings is as remote as if over a long-distance telephone. They do not feel directly, but only give ideas about their feelings. They are not affected by their affects. Their emotions give them no motion. Like Eliot's hollow men, they experience themselves as shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. In psychotherapy, when such persons are unable to experience their feelings, they often have to learn to feel by answering the question day after day, just how do I feel right now? What is most important is not how much one feels, and we certainly do not mean that it is necessary to effervesce, that is sentimentality rather than sentiment, affectation and not affect. Rather, what is important is the experience that it is I, the active one, who is doing the feeling. This carries with it a directness and immediacy of feeling. One experiences the affect on all levels of oneself. One feels with a heightened aliveness. Then, instead of one's feelings being limited like notes in a bugle call, The mature person becomes able to differentiate feelings into as many nuances, strong and passionate experiences, or delicate and sensitive ones, as in the different passages of music in a symphony. This also means that we need to recover our awareness of our bodies. An infant gets part of his early sense of personal identity through awareness of his body. We may call the body as experienced by the infant, says Gardner Murphy, the first core of the self. The baby reaches his leg time and again, and sooner or later there is the experience. Here is this leg, I can feel it, and it belongs to me. Sexual feelings are particularly significant because they are among the earliest feelings which the child can refer directly to himself. When sexual areas are stimulated in play or by clothing, there is the rudimentary beginning of the experience of feeling oneself. Unfortunately, sexual feelings and those connected with toilet experiences have been widely tabooed in the past in our society, and the child has been given to understand that such feelings are naughty. Since such feelings are a part of his way of identifying himself, the taboo would clearly imply your image of yourself is dirty. This undoubtedly is one important part of the origin of the tendency to despise the self in our society. The ability to be aware of one's body has a great importance all through life. It is a curious fact that most adults have so lost physical awareness that they are unable to tell how their leg feels if you should ask them, or their ankle, or their middle finger, or any other part of the body. In our society, the awareness of the different parts of the body is generally limited to some borderline schizophrenics and other sophisticated people who have come under the influence of yoga or other Eastern exercises. Most people act on the principle, let hands or feet feel as they may, I must get off to work. As a result of several centuries of suppressing the body into an inanimate machine, subordinated to the purposes of modern industrialism, people are proud of paying no attention to the body. They treat it as an object for manipulation, as though it were a truck to be driven till it runs out of gas. The only concern they give it is a thought each week as perfunctory as a phone call to a relative to ask how he is, but with really no intention of taking the answer seriously. Nature then comes along, if we may speak metaphorically, and knocks the person down with colds or the flu or more severe illnesses, as though she were saying, "When will you learn to listen to your body?" The impersonal, separated attitude toward the body is shown also in the way most people, once they become physically ill, react to the sickness. They speak in the passive voice, "I got sick," picturing their body as an object just as they would say, "I got hit by a car." Then they shrug their shoulders and regard their responsibility fulfilled if they go to bed and place themselves completely in the hands of the doctor and the new medical miracle drugs. Thus they use scientific progress as a rationalization for passivity. They know how germs or virus or allergies attack the body, and they also know how penicillin or sulfa or some other drug cures them. The attitude toward disease is not that of the self-aware person who experiences his body as part of himself, but of the compartmentalized person who might express his passive attitude in a sentence like, "The pneumococcus made me sick, but penicillin made me well again." Certainly, it is only common sense to avail oneself of all the help science can give, but that is no reason to surrender one's own sovereignty over one's body. When one does surrender autonomy, one opens oneself to psychosomatic ills of all sorts. Many disturbances of bodily function, beginning in such simple things as incorrect walking or faulty posture or breathing, are due to the fact that people have all their lives walked, to take only one simple illustration, as though they were machines and have never experienced any of the feelings in their feet or legs or rest of the body. The correcting of the malfunction of one's legs, for example, often requires that one learn again to feel what is happening when one walks. In overcoming psychosomatic ills or chronic diseases like tuberculosis, it is essential to learn to listen to the body in deciding when to work and when to rest. It is amazing how many hints and guides and intuitions for living come to the sensitive person who has ears to hear what his body is saying. To be tuned to the responses throughout one's body, as well as to be tuned to one's feelings in emotional relations with the world and people around him, is to be on the way to a health which will not break down periodically. Not only do people separate the body from the self in using it as an instrument for work, but they likewise separate it from the self in their pursuit of pleasure. The body is treated as a vehicle of sensation, from which one can get certain gastronomical pleasures and sexual sensations if skillfully handled, just as though one were tuning a television set. The detached attitude towards sex, which we already noted in a previous chapter, is connected with this tendency to separate the body from the rest of the self. The Kinsey report speaks of the sexual partner as a sexual object, and in the same vein, many persons think in terms of my sexual needs require some outlet, rather than I want and choose sexual relations with this particular person. The tendency to separate sexual activity from the rest of the self is, as everyone knows, illustrated on one hand by the Puritan attitudes. But it is not so widely realized that libertinism, the opposite to Puritanism, commits exactly the same error of separating sex from the self. We are proposing welcoming the body back into the union with the self. This means, as already suggested, recovering an active awareness of one's body. It means experiencing one's body, the pleasure of eating or resting, or the exhilaration of using toned-up muscles, or the gratification of sexual impulses and passion, as aspects of the acting self. It is not the attitude of my body feels, but I feel. In sex, it is the attitude of experiencing sexual desire and passion as one aspect of interpersonal relationships. Separating sex from the rest of the self, indeed, is no more tenable than to isolate one's larynx and speak of my vocal cords wanting to talk with my friend. We propose, furthermore, placing the self in the center of the picture of bodily health. It is I who grow sick or achieve health. We propose the active rather than passive voice in illness. The old expression, I sicken, is accurate. Fortunately, in at least one disease, the active verb is still used for the process of getting well. Tuberculosis patients say, I cured at such and such a sanatorium. We propose that illnesses, whether physical or psychological, be taken not as periodic accidents which occur to the body or to the personality or mind, but as nature's means of re-educating the whole person. Using illness as re-education is illustrated in a letter a patient with tuberculosis wrote to a friend. The disease occurred not simply because I overworked or ran athwart some TB bugs, but because I was trying to be something I wasn't. I was living as the great extrovert, running here and there, doing 3 jobs at once, and leaving undeveloped and unused the side of me which would contemplate, would read and think and invite my soul, rather than rushing and working at full speed. The disease comes as a demand and an opportunity to rediscover the lost functions of myself. It is as though the disease were nature's way of saying, you must become your whole self. To the extent that you do not, you will be ill, and you will become well only to the extent that you do become yourself. We may add that it is an actual clinical fact that some persons, viewing their illnesses as an opportunity for re-education, become more healthy both psychologically and physically, more fulfilled as persons, after a serious illness than before. This way of experiencing illness and health will help us overcome the dichotomy between body and mind, which has so bedeviled modern man. When one looks at the different illnesses from the perspective of the self, he sees that physical, psychological, and spiritual, using the last term to refer to despair and the sense of meaninglessness in life, diseases are all aspects of the same difficulty of the self in finding itself in its world. It is well known, for example, that the different kinds of illness may serve interchangeable purposes for the individual. Physical illness may relieve psychological troubles by giving some focus for floating anxiety. The person then has something concrete to worry about, and that is a lot less painful than vague floating anxiety. Or by giving needed respite from responsibility to those who have not learned to assume responsibility maturely. And many a person, through a bout of influenza or more serious disease, has relieved his guilt feelings, however unconstructive such a method may be. Thus, so long as scientific progress takes away diphtheria, tuberculosis, and other diseases, a consummation devoutly to be wished, without helping people to get over their anxiety, guilt, emptiness, and purposelessness, sickness is only forced into a new channel. That may sound like a rash statement, but in principle I believe it is true. The struggle against disease in the compartmentalized way is like Hercules' battle against the seven-headed Hydra. Every time he cut off one head, another grew in its place. The battle for health must be won on the deeper level of the integration of the self. Certainly, it is no depreciation of the great value of the new medical discoveries to emphasize that we shall make lasting progress in health only to the extent that we go beyond finding means of killing germs and bacilli and external organisms which invade the body, and discover means of helping ourselves and other people so to affirm their own beings that they will not need to be sick. Awareness of one's feelings lays the groundwork for the second step, knowing what one wants. This point may look very simple at first glance. Who does not know what he wants? But as we pointed out in the first chapter, the amazing thing is how few people actually do. If one looks honestly into himself, does he not find that most of what he thinks he wants is just routine, like fish on Friday, or that what he wants is what he thinks he should want, like being a success in his work, or wants to want, like loving his neighbor? One can often see clearly the expression of direct and honest wants in children before they have been taught to falsify their desires. The child exclaims, "I like ice cream, I want a cone," and there is no confusion about who wants what. Such directness of desire often comes like a breath of fresh air in a murky land. It may not be best that he have the cone at the time, and it is obviously the parent's responsibility to say yes or no if the child is not mature enough to decide. But let the parents not teach the child to falsify his emotions by trying to persuade him that he does not want the cone. To be aware of one's feelings and desires does not at all imply expressing them indiscriminately wherever one happens to be. Judgment and decision, as we shall see later, are part of any mature consciousness of self. But how is one going to have a basis for judging what he will or will not do unless he first knows what he wants? For an adolescent to be aware that he has erotic impulses towards some person of the opposite sex sitting across from him in the streetcar, or towards his mother, does not at all mean that he acts on these impulses. But suppose he never lets these impulses reach the threshold of awareness because they are not socially acceptable? How is he then to know years later, when he is married, whether he engages in sexual relations with his wife because he really wants to, or whether because this is then the acceptable and expected act, the routine thing to do? People who voice with alarm the caution that unless desires and emotions are suppressed, they will pop out every which way, and everyone, for example, will be overcome by sexual desire for his mother or his best friend's wife, are talking about neurotic emotions. As a matter of fact, we know that it is precisely the emotions and desires which have been repressed which later return to drive the person compulsively. The Victorian gyroscope kind of man had to control his emotions rigidly, for, by virtue of having locked them up in jail, he had turned them into lawbreakers. But the more integrated a person is, the less compulsive become his emotions. In the mature person, feelings and wants occur in a configuration. In seeing a dinner as part of a drama on the stage, to give a simple example, one is not consumed with desire for food. one came to see a drama and not to eat. Or when listening to a concert singer, one is not consumed with sexual desire even though she may be very attractive. The configuration is set by the fact that one chose in coming to hear music. Of course, as we have indicated throughout this book, none of us escape conflicts from time to time, but these are different from being compulsively driven by emotions. Every direct and immediate experience of feeling and wanting is spontaneous and unique. That is to say, the wanting and feeling are uniquely part of that particular situation at that particular time and place. Spontaneity means to be able to respond directly to the total picture, or, as it is technically called, to respond to the figure-ground configuration. Spontaneity is the act of I becoming part of the figure ground. In a good portrait painting, the background is always an integral part of the portrait. So an act of a mature human being is an integral part of the self in relation to the world around it. Spontaneity, thus, is very different from effervescence or egocentricity or letting out one's feelings regardless of the environment. Spontaneity, rather, is the acting I responding to a particular environment at a given moment. The originality and uniqueness, which is always part of a spontaneous feeling, can be understood in this light. For just as there never was exactly that situation before and never will be again, so the feeling one has at that time is new and never to be exactly repeated. It is only neurotic behavior which is rigidly repetitive. The third step, along with rediscovering our feelings and wants, is to recover our relation with the subconscious aspects of ourselves. We shall add only some brief comments about this step. As modern man has given up sovereignty over his body, so also he has surrendered the unconscious side of his personality, and it has become almost alien to him. In earlier chapters, we have seen how the suppression of the irrational, subjective, and unconscious aspects of experience went hand in hand with modern man's need to emphasize regular, rational work in the world of industry and commerce. Now we need to find and welcome back, so far as we can, what we suppressed. All through the ages, even before the time when Joseph interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh, until the modern period, people have regarded their dreams, for example, as sources of wisdom, guidance, and insight. But most of us today think of our dreams as odd episodes, as foreign as some strange ceremonial dance in Tibet. This results in the cutting off of an exceedingly great and significant portion of the self. We are then no longer able to use much of the wisdom and power of the unconscious. It puts us in the position of trying to drive a chariot with reins attached to only one horse, in Plato's time-honored figure, with the 4 or 5 other horses pulling off in different directions. Though the tendencies and intuitions in the unconscious are blocked off from our conscious awareness, they are still part of the self and accessible in various degrees to being made conscious. The sooner we recover sovereignty in that portion of the kingdom, the better. To go into dream interpretation in any detail would take us too far afield from our topic in this chapter. Understanding dreams is of course a subtle and complex matter, though it is not so complex as one would think when he reads about the esoteric symbols in much modern dream interpretation. These esoteric symbols put the whole problem back into a foreign language again, and that is another way, perhaps the typically modern way, of surrendering our sovereignty over the unconscious aspects of ourselves. As though we were saying, the authorities and those who know the magic answers can understand our dreams, but we cannot understand ourselves. Dr. Erich Fromm's recent book, The Forgotten Language, points out that dreams, like myths and fairy tales, are not at all a foreign language, but are in reality part of one universal language shared by all mankind. Fromm's book is to be recommended to the non-technical reader who wishes to relearn something about this subconscious language of his fatherland. In this chapter, we wish only to bespeak a sympathetic attitude toward dreams and other expressions of the subconscious and unconscious aspects of ourselves. Dreams are expressions not only of conflicts and repressed desires, but also of previous knowledge that one has learned, possibly many years before, and thinks he has forgotten. Even the unskilled person, if he takes the attitude that what his dreams tell him is not simply to be rejected as silly, may get occasional useful guidance from his dreams. And the person who has become skillful in the understanding of what he is saying to himself in his dreams can get from them, from time to time, marvelously valuable hints and insights into solutions to his problems. The upshot of this chapter has been to show that the more self-awareness a person has, the more alive he is. The more consciousness, remarked Kierkegaard, the more self. Becoming a person means this heightened awareness, this heightened experience of I-ness, this experience that it is I, the acting one, who is the subject of what is occurring. This view of what it means to become a person, in conclusion, saves us from two errors. The first is passivism, letting the deterministic forces in one's experience take the place of self-awareness. It must be admitted that some tendencies in the older forms of psychoanalysis can be used to rationalize passivism. It was the epoch-making discovery of Freud to show how much every person is pushed by unconscious fears, desires, and tendencies of all sorts, and that man is really much less a master in the household of his own mind than the 19th century man of willpower fondly believed. But a harmful implication was carried along with this emphasis on the determinism of unconscious forces, which Freud himself partly succumbed to. The early psychotherapist Grodek, for example, wrote, "We are lived by our unconscious," and Freud in a letter commended him for his emphasis on the passivity of the ego. But we must underline, to correct a partial misunderstanding, that the overall purpose of Freud's exploration of the unconscious forces was to help people bring these forces into consciousness. The goal of psychoanalysis, as he said time and again, was to make the unconscious conscious, to enlarge the scope of awareness, to help the individual become aware of the unconscious tendencies which have tended to push the self around like mutinous sailors who have seized power below the deck of the ship, and thus to help the person consciously direct his own ship. Hence the emphasis in this chapter on the heightened awareness of oneself, and the warning against passivism have much in common with the overall purpose of Freud's thought. The other error this view of the person enables us to avoid is activism. That is, using activity as a substitute for awareness. By activism, we mean the tendency, so common in this country, to assume that the more one is acting, the more one is alive. It should be clear that when we have used the term the active I in this book, we have not meant busyness or merely doing things. Many people keep busy all the time as a way of covering up anxiety. Their activism is a way of running from themselves. They get a pseudo and temporary sense of aliveness by being in a hurry, as though something is going on if they are but moving, and as though being busy is a proof of one's importance. Chaucer had a sly and astute comment about this type, represented in The Merchant in Canterbury Tales. "Methinks he seemed busier than he was." Our emphasis on self-awareness certainly includes acting as an expression of the alive, integrated self, but it is the opposite to activism, the opposite, that is, to acting as an escape from self-awareness. Aliveness often means the capacity not to act, to be creatively idle, which may be more difficult for most modern people than to do something. To be idle, Robert Louis Stevenson accurately wrote, requires a strong sense of personal identity. Self-awareness, as we have proposed it, brings back into the picture the example which the Western world, to its peril, has all but lost. It brings a new appreciation for being something rather than merely doing something. With such a relation to oneself, work for us modern men, who are the great toilers and producers, will not be an escape from ourselves or a way of trying to prove our worth, but a creative expression of the spontaneous powers of the person who has consciously affirmed his relatedness to his world and his fellow men.